Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey that will forever change how you look at that precious ring on your finger, the one that's supposed to symbolize eternal love and commitment. What if I told you that your beautiful wedding ring carries secrets so dark, so twisted, that ancient civilizations would literally shiver in fear just hearing about them? You're standing at the altar, gazing into your beloved's eyes as they slip that gleaming band onto your finger. But here's what nobody tells you. You're unknowingly participating in a ritual that began with grave robbing, soul stealing, and practices so macabre that even horror movies wouldn't dare show them. The ancient Egyptians believed that wedding rings didn't just contain precious metals. They contained the actual souls of the dead, trapped forever in circular prisons of gold and silver. And that tradition of wearing your ring on the fourth finger of your left hand, it comes from a belief so chilling that when you learn the truth, you'll never look at your hand the same way again. Are you ready to discover what your wedding ring is really saying about you? Before we dive deeper into these spine-tingling secrets together, I'd love it if you could show this video some love. Hit that like button if you're already feeling the chills. And don't forget to subscribe because trust me, the stories I've lined up for you will keep you coming back for more. And hey, I'm curious, where are you watching this from tonight? Maybe you're somewhere cozy with the lights dimmed? Drop a comment and let me know because there's something magical about sharing these ancient mysteries together. Now get comfortable, maybe grab a warm drink, and let's uncover the shocking truth about your wedding ring's dark origins. The Egyptian soul binders, rings forged from the afterlife. Most people think wedding rings are all about love, right? Innocent symbols of, till death do us part. But here's where it gets really interesting and a little unsettling. The very first wedding rings weren't created to celebrate. They were actually designed as ownership tags. Yes, you heard that right, like the tag we put on our pets today. Let me paint you a picture of ancient Egypt around 4,800 years ago. The Nile is flowing, pyramids are rising, and in the bustling marketplaces of Memphis, something extraordinary is happening. But it's not what you'd expect. Egyptian couples aren't exchanging rings in romantic ceremonies. Instead, they're participating in rituals that would make modern ghost hunters pack up and leave. The Egyptians believed that when you died, your soul needed a way to recognize your earthly possessions in the afterlife. They developed this fascinating and frankly terrifying practice. They would take rings from people who had recently passed away, melt them down, and forge new rings for living couples. The idea was that these rings contained the wisdom, the experiences, and yes, the actual spirits of the deceased. Now, here's where it gets really wild. Any dead people we're talking about. Egyptian ring makers specifically sought out the graves of couples who had been married for decades, who had weathered life's storms together. They believed that by incorporating metal from their rings into new ones, they were literally transferring the secrets of a successful marriage to newlyweds. But there was a dark side to this practice, and I mean really dark. Grave robbing became so common for wedding ring materials that Egyptian pharaohs had to post guards at cemeteries, your eternal resting place being disturbed just so someone could make their wedding rings more powerful. The Egyptians believed that if you wore a ring containing the wrong kind of spirit, say from a couple who had a bitter, angry marriage, their negative energy would curse your own relationship. There are actually hieroglyphic warnings found in tombs that roughly translate to, "Disturb our rings and your love shall turn to poison." And you know what's absolutely mind-blowing? We still follow some of these traditions today without even realizing it. That circular shape of your ring, the Egyptians chose because they believed circles had no beginning and no end, making them perfect prisons for souls. The metal itself was seen as a conductor between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Here's something that might give you goosebumps. In 1922, when Howard Carter discovered King Tutankhamun's tomb, he found over 143 pieces of jewelry, including several rings that appeared to be wedding bands. But here's the strange part. Carter's team reported hearing whispers and feeling cold spots whenever they handled these particular rings. 3 members of the excavation team who directly handled Tut's wedding jewelry died under mysterious circumstances within 2 years of discovery. Coincidence maybe, but the Egyptians would have said, "We told you so." Now you might be thinking, that's ancient Egypt. Surely other civilizations were more normal about their wedding rings, right? Oh, my friend. If you think the Egyptians were intense, wait until you hear what was happening in other parts of the ancient world. Because it turns out using rings to bind souls together was just the beginning of humanity's strange obsession with wedding jewelry. But that's a story for another moment in our journey. We're going to travel back even further in time to an era when wedding rings weren't made of precious metals at all. We're talking about a time when your engagement ring might have literally been your enemy's tooth, and your wedding band could have been carved from the bones of ancient beasts. The truth about humanity's very first attempts at wedding jewelry will shock you even more than what we've already uncovered tonight. The first rings, bones, teeth, and prehistoric promises. Let's step into our time machine and journey back to an era that would make even the bravest among us question everything we think we know about romance. We're going way, way back, about 40,000 years ago, to a time when your idea of the perfect engagement ring would have been, let's just say, Tiffany & Company would have gone out of business pretty quickly. You're a Cro-Magnon woman, and the hunky caveman next door wants to show his commitment to you. Does he carve you a beautiful wooden ring? Maybe fashion something delicate from flowers? No, my friends. He shows up at your cave with a necklace made from the teeth of the saber-toothed tiger he just killed. And if you're really special, he might throw in a finger bone or two from his latest enemy. But here's what's absolutely fascinating, and this is where it gets really wild. These weren't just random acts of prehistoric barbarism. These early wedding rings were actually incredibly sophisticated symbols that told entire stories about the relationship. Let me blow your mind with this. Archaeologists have discovered Neanderthal burial sites in France, where couples were buried together, and the woman's finger bones show clear evidence of wearing rings made from mammoth ivory that have been carefully carved and polished. Dr. Helene Monsell from the French National Museum of Natural History made a discovery in 2018 that completely changed how we understand prehistoric relationships. In the Berniquel Cave in southern France, she found evidence of what appears to be the world's first engagement ceremony, dating back over 176,000 years, contained carefully arranged rings of stalagmites, and at the center, bone rings that have been painstakingly crafted and deliberately placed. But here's where it gets deliciously dark. This will change how you think about promise rings forever. These early humans didn't just make rings from any old bones. They were incredibly specific about whose bones they used. Warriors would craft rings from the finger bones of enemies they defeated in battle. The idea was that wearing your enemy's bones would transfer their strength to your relationship. Imagine explaining that tradition at a modern engagement party. And the women, they weren't passive recipients in this whole affair. Female remains from this period show evidence of wearing multiple bone rings, each representing a different conquest or achievement of their partner. It was like a prehistoric resume worn on your fingers. Oh, this little ring? That's from the mammoth my husband killed to feed our tribe for 3 months. From the rival tribe leader who challenged him for my hand. Now, you might think this sounds absolutely savage, but here's the beautiful irony. These relationships appear to have lasted longer than many modern marriages. Archaeological evidence suggests that couples who participated in these bone ring ceremonies stayed together until death. We're talking about divorce rates that would make marriage counselors weep with joy. The Viking vows, rings of conquest and blood. It gets even more interesting. The Vikings, those legendary seafaring warriors, took this bone ring tradition and turned it into an art form. They created what they called enemy rings, crafted from the teeth and bones of fallen foes. But here's the twist that'll give you chills. They believed that each ring contained the fighting spirit of the defeated warrior, and that wearing multiple rings would make you nearly invincible in battle. The famous Viking explorer who founded the first Norse settlement in Greenland around 985 AD was said to wear 17 different bone rings on his fingers and toes, each one representing a different enemy he conquered. Jodhild wore a matching set that told the story of their relationship through carved symbols and victory marks. But the most spine-tingling part of this tradition, the Vikings believed that when one spouse died, the surviving partner had to add a piece of their deceased beloved's bone to their ring collection. This wasn't seen as macabre. It was the ultimate expression of "till death do us part." Talk about commitment issues being solved. Here's something that'll make you appreciate your comfortable modern life. Making these rings wasn't easy. The bone had to be carved during specific moon phases using tools made from meteorite iron when possible. The Vikings believed that rings carved during a full moon would bring victory in battle, while rings made during a new moon would ensure fertility and long life. And if you think the men had it tough, consider the women's role in this tradition. Viking women were expected to personally prepare the bones of their husbands' enemies for ring making. This involved a complex process of cleaning, blessing, and carving that could take weeks. Imagine that on your to-do list. Monday, grocery shopping. Tuesday, clean house. prepare enemy bones for wedding jewelry. The most fascinating discovery came in 1997 when archaeologists uncovered a Viking burial ship in Norway. Inside, they found a couple buried together, and their hands were clasped with their fingers interlocked, showing off intricate bone rings that perfectly complemented each other. Chemical analysis revealed that the rings contained bone fragments from at least 12 different individuals. Their relationship was literally built on their shared victories. Here's where this ancient tradition connects to something you might recognize today. Ever wonder why we have a saying, blood, sweat, and tears, when talking about relationships? It comes directly from these bone ring ceremonies. Vikings believed that for a ring to be truly powerful, it needed to contain elements of all three: sweat from the battle and tears from the victory celebration. And you know what's absolutely mind-blowing? Some of these traditions survived longer than you might think. As late as the 16th century, in remote parts of Scandinavia, there were still reports of wedding ceremonies that included bone elements in the rings. The practice only fully disappeared when Christianity completely took hold in these regions. The next time someone complains about the cost of a modern engagement ring, just remind them that at least they don't have to personally defeat an enemy in combat and craft jewelry from their remains. Although I have to admit, it certainly would cut down on the which style do you prefer conversations. But as incredible as these bone and tooth traditions were, they pale in comparison to what was happening in ancient Egypt during the same period. Because while our cave-dwelling ancestors were making rings from their enemies, the Egyptians were developing practices that would make even the most hardened bone ring warrior think twice about getting married. The cursed couple's chamber and ring madness. Imagine you're walking to the golden sands of ancient Egypt, where the mighty pyramids cast their shadows across a civilization that would make our modern world seem, well, let's just say they had some practices that would give Stephen King nightmares. The Egyptians didn't just believe in the afterlife. They were absolutely terrified of what their wedding rings might do to them once they crossed over to the other side. While our prehistoric ancestors were making rings from bones, the Egyptians were developing something far more sinister. They believed that wedding rings were actually portals, gateways between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. And if you thought modern relationship drama was complicated, wait until you hear about couples who literally fear their own jewelry would drag them into eternal damnation. Let me tell you about a discovery that sent chills down the spines of every archaeologist involved. In 1924, just 2 years after King Tut's tomb was opened, a team led by George Reisner uncovered what's now known as the Cursed Couple's Chamber near the Giza Pyramids. Inside this tomb, they found two mummified figures, a husband and wife from around 2500 BC. But here's the spine-tingling part. Their wedding rings had been deliberately broken and scattered around the burial chamber. Why would someone break wedding rings before burial? According to the hieroglyphic warnings carved into the chamber walls, this couple had experienced what the Egyptians called ring madness during their lifetime. The text described how their rings had begun to glow with an eerie light during the night, and how the couple reported hearing whispers of long-dead pharaohs emanating from the metal. Egypt's former Minister of Tourism and Antiquities documented over 40 similar cases where Egyptian couples had their rings destroyed before burial specifically to prevent what they called eternal binding to the wrong spirits. Think about that for a moment. These people were so terrified of their wedding rings that they preferred to enter the afterlife without them rather than risk spiritual contamination. Here's where it gets really fascinating and terrifying. The Egyptians had developed an entire science around what they called ring divination. Palace records from the reign of Ramesses II describe court officials whose job was specifically to examine wedding rings for signs of spiritual corruption. These ring readers could supposedly tell if a couple's rings contained malevolent spirits just by holding them. One particularly chilling account from the papyrus scrolls of Amenhotep III tells the story of a wealthy merchant named Kate and his wife Isetnofret. According to the records, their wedding rings, made from gold taken from a recently robbed tomb, began to change color during their marriage ceremony. The gold allegedly turned black, and both rings started to emit what witnesses described as the sound of weeping souls. The ceremony was immediately stopped, and temple priests were called in to perform what they called a ring exorcism. The scrolls report that within 7 days, both Kate and Isetnofret had fallen into what we might today call a catatonic state, claiming they could hear the voices of angry dead couples arguing inside their heads. Now, you might think this is all just ancient superstition, but here's what'll give you goosebumps. When Howard Carter's team analyzed the metal composition of various Egyptian wedding rings found in tombs, they discovered something extraordinary. Many of these rings contained trace amounts of materials that shouldn't have existed in ancient Egypt, metals that appeared to be of meteoric origin. The Egyptians believed that metal from the heavens carried the voices of the gods, but also the potential for divine punishment. They thought that wearing rings made from meteoric gold was like having a direct hotline to the afterlife, which sounds amazing until you realize they believed the connection worked both ways. Dead pharaohs could allegedly use these rings to influence the living, or even to drag living souls into the underworld before their time. Professor Joanne Fletcher from the University of York made a fascinating discovery in 2019 when studying mummified remains from the Valley of the Kings. She found evidence that many Egyptian couples deliberately wore their wedding rings on different fingers than we do today. Not the fourth finger of the left hand, but on the thumb of the right hand, because they believed this finger was furthest from the heart, reducing the risk of spiritual contamination reaching their soul. But the most bone-chilling part of Egyptian ring tradition was something called a pharaoh's curse transfer. When a pharaoh died, palace officials would gather all the wedding rings from the royal burial chamber and redistribute them to condemned criminals before their execution. The idea was that any curse attached to the pharaoh's rings would be transferred to people who were already going to die, protecting the living population. Imagine being a newlywed in ancient Egypt and finding out your beautiful wedding rings once belonged to a pharaoh who died under mysterious circumstances. The psychological terror alone would be enough to ruin any honeymoon. Here's something that connects directly to modern times and might make you look at your own ring differently. The Egyptian practice of ring consecration. Before any wedding ceremony, Egyptian couples had to take their rings to temple priests who would perform elaborate rituals to cleanse the metal of any previous spiritual attachments. This process could take up to 40 days and involve burying the rings in sacred sand, exposing them to specific lunar cycles, and chanting protective spells. The really spooky part? Some of these consecration rituals are still practiced today in certain parts of Egypt. Though most people don't realize the dark origins of these traditions, modern Egyptian jewelers in Old Cairo still perform simplified versions of these blessing ceremonies, though they'll probably just tell you for good luck rather than explaining the whole, preventing your ring from becoming possessed by angry dead pharaoh's thing. And here's a detail that'll make you appreciate modern jewelry shopping. Egyptian couples weren't allowed to see their wedding rings until the actual ceremony. Rings were kept in special sealed chambers within temples, guarded by priests who wore protective amulets, specifically designed to shield them from any negative spiritual energy the rings might contain. One particularly detailed account from the tomb of Seneb, a court dwarf who served under Pharaoh Pepi II, describes how his wedding rings were kept in a lead-lined box for 6 months before his marriage ceremony. Every full moon, priests would open the box just long enough to perform purification rituals. But even they wouldn't touch the rings directly. They used special golden tongs that were melted down and reformed after each ceremony. The Egyptians were so paranoid about ring contamination that they developed an entire industry around ring insurance. Wealthy families would commission multiple sets of wedding rings, storing the extras in different temples across Egypt. If one set became cursed or contaminated, they could quickly replace it with a backup set from a different location. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Egyptian ring tradition was their belief in what they called phantom rings. These were invisible rings that dead spouses would allegedly place on the fingers of their living partners during dreams. Egyptian medical papyri from around 1500 BC describe treatments for people who complained of feeling phantom rings on their fingers after their spouse's death. Sensations so real that some people would scratch their fingers raw trying to remove rings that weren't physically there. As terrifying as these Egyptian traditions were, they seem almost quaint compared to what the Greeks were doing with their wedding rings. Because while the Egyptians feared their rings might connect them to dead pharaohs, the Greeks believed their rings could literally summon the gods themselves. And trust me, that's not always a good thing when you're dealing with deities who have serious anger management issues. The Greek gods and their rings of wrath. Welcome to ancient Greece, where the gods were petty, vengeful, and apparently had very strong opinions about your choice in wedding jewelry. If you thought dealing with difficult in-laws was bad, imagine having Zeus himself crash your wedding because he didn't approve of your ring. The Greeks didn't just wear wedding rings. They essentially strapped tiny divine lightning rods to their fingers and hoped for the best. Let me take you back to around 800 BC to the bustling agora of Athens, where a young couple named Alexios and Penthesilea are about to make a decision that will literally determine whether they live happily ever after or become cautionary tales whispered by future generations. The Greeks believed that wedding rings weren't just symbols. They were actual contract with the gods, and breaking those contracts could result in divine punishment that would make your worst breakup look like a pleasant afternoon tea. The story begins with Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity. According to Greek mythology, when Zeus chained Prometheus to that rock, where an eagle would eat his liver for eternity, one small piece of the divine fire fell to earth and was forged into the very first metal ring. The Greeks believed that every wedding ring made from metal contained a tiny spark of this stolen divine fire, which meant wearing one was basically carrying around evidence of humanity's greatest theft from the gods. Now, here's where it gets absolutely wild. The Greeks developed an entire theological framework around what they called divine ring resonance. They believed that certain combinations of metals, gems, and craftsmanship could literally tune your ring to the frequency of different gods. Want Aphrodite's blessing? You better hope your ring contained the right mixture of copper and rose quartz. Looking for Hera's protection for your marriage? You'd need silver blessed under a full moon and a sapphire that had never seen sunlight. But here's the terrifying part. Get the formula wrong, and you might accidentally summon the attention of a god who really didn't want to be bothered. The historical records from the Temple of Apollo at Delphi contain over 200 documented cases, ring-induced divine wrath. These weren't just superstitious stories. These were official temple records complete with witness testimonies and detailed descriptions of the supernatural punishments that befell couples who wore the wrong rings. One particularly chilling account from 650 BC tells the story of a wealthy merchant named Lysander who commissioned a wedding ring for his bride from gold that had been stolen from a temple dedicated to Artemis. The ring was beautiful, inlaid with emeralds and carved with intricate patterns depicting hunting scenes. But 3 days after the wedding, both Lysander and his wife were found in their home, apparently having aged decades overnight. Witnesses described them as looking like they had lived entire lifetimes in the span of 72 hours. The temple priests investigated and discovered that the ring's gold had been taken from a sacred statue of Artemis during a temple robbery. According to their interpretation, the goddess had compressed the couple's natural lifespan into 3 days as punishment for wearing jewelry made from her stolen treasures. It was immediately melted down, and the gold returned to the temple, but the damage was done. Lysander and his wife died of apparent old age before their 25th birthdays. Dr. Sarah Morris from UCLA, a leading expert on ancient Greek religious practices, has documented similar cases throughout the Mediterranean region. Her research, published in the Journal of Hellenic Studies, shows that Greek communities kept detailed records of what they called ring curses, supernatural punishments that allegedly befell couples who violated divine protocols in their choice of wedding jewelry. But the Greeks didn't just fear accidental divine wrath. They actively tried to weaponize it. The practice of cursed rings became so common that Athens actually passed laws regulating their creation. These were wedding rings deliberately crafted to bring misfortune to rival couples. Imagine being so petty that you commission a cursed wedding ring just to ruin someone else's marriage. The Greeks basically invented supernatural passive aggression. The most infamous case involved a woman named Medea of Corinth, not the mythological sorceress, but a real person who lived around 550 BC. Historical records from the Corinthian archives describe how she created wedding rings embedded with what she claimed were tears of the Furies, actually a form of lead that would slowly poison the wearers over time. She would gift these rings to couples she disliked, presenting them as generous wedding presents while secretly orchestrating their doom. Here's something that'll give you chills. Medea's poison rings were so effective that the practice spread throughout the Greek world. By 500 BC, it had become common for Greek couples to have their wedding rings tested by temple priests before wearing them. These priests, called metallurgists of the divine, could supposedly detect cursed metals by observing how they reacted to sacred flames. The testing process was elaborate and terrifying. The rings would be placed on a special altar dedicated to Hermes, the messenger god, while priests chanted protective spells. If the metal glowed with gold, it was considered blessed. If it turned black or emitted smoke, it was deemed cursed and had to be destroyed immediately. But if the ring simply melted during the ceremony, that was considered a sign that the gods were so offended by the ring that they refused to let it exist at all. One of the most fascinating aspects of Greek ring tradition was their belief in divine matchmaking. They thought that the gods could influence who you married based on how your ring interacted with potential partners' jewelry. Greek singles would actually wear special courtship rings to social gatherings, and romantic compatibility was determined by how these rings behaved when brought near each other. Plutarch, the famous Greek historian, described attending a wedding in Athens where the bride and groom's rings literally sparked when they touched during the ceremony. The crowd took this as a sign that Zeus himself approved of the match, and the couple was showered with gifts and blessings. But in his account of other weddings, he describes rings that grew cold when brought together, or even rings that caused physical pain when both partners wore them simultaneously. Clear signs of divine disapproval. The Greeks were so serious about divine approval for marriages that they developed what might be the world's first relationship compatibility test based entirely on wedding ring behavior. Couples would spend 40 days wearing their rings while performing various activities together, cooking, praying, while priests observe how the rings responded to different emotional states. Here's where it gets really interesting from a psychological perspective. This system actually worked pretty well for relationship compatibility. Modern marriage counselors would probably applaud the Greeks for requiring couples to spend extended time together, observing each other's behavior in various situations before committing to marriage. They probably wouldn't endorse the whole consulting the gods through magical jewelry aspect, but the basic principle was surprisingly sound. The most elaborate Greek ring ceremony on record took place in 480 BC during the wedding of a Spartan general named Pausanias. His bride's ring was crafted from iron taken from the spear of Achilles, or at least iron that was claimed to be from the legendary hero's weapon. The wedding ceremony lasted 3 full days while priests performed continuous rituals to ensure that Achilles' warrior spirit would bless the marriage rather than curse it. According to Herodotus, the ceremony was so intense that several wedding guests fainted from the spiritual energy allegedly radiating from the ring. The bride reportedly had visions of ancient battles during the ring exchange, and the groom claimed he could hear the voices of fallen warriors whispering advice about marriage. Whether you believe in the supernatural aspects or not, you have to admire the psychological drama these ceremonies created. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Greek ring tradition was their belief in ring succession. When a married person died, their wedding ring was supposed to choose its next owner from among the living. Rings were left on altars in temples, and priests would observe which potential wearers the ring seemed to favor, often determined by strange coincidences, dreams, or unexplained phenomena. Records contain accounts of rings that allegedly moved on their own, rings that felt warm to certain people and cold to others, and rings that caused prophetic dreams and potential new owners. Whether these were genuine supernatural occurrences or clever priestly manipulation, the psychological impact was profound. People genuinely believed that their dead spouse's ring was actively choosing their next partner. As sophisticated as Greek ring traditions were, they were nothing compared to the Romans, who took the concept of wedding rings and turned it into an instrument of empire, conquest, and political control that would make modern politicians green with envy. Roman rings of iron and conquest entered the Roman Empire, where wedding rings became weapons of war, symbols of conquest, and tools of political domination that would make modern power couples look like amateur hour. The Romans didn't just wear wedding rings. They literally branded their wives with iron, collected enemy jewelry as battle trophies, and turned marriage ceremonies into displays of imperial might that could start or end wars. Picture the cobblestone streets of Rome in 100 AD, where the sound of marching legions mingles with the clang of hammer on anvil. In the workshops near the Forum, blacksmiths aren't just crafting weapons. They're forging what the Romans called annulus ferius, iron wedding rings that were as much about ownership as they were about love. And when I say ownership, I mean in the most literal, uncomfortable way possible, as documented in the Corpus Juris Civilis, explicitly stated that a woman's wedding ring served as a legal brand, much like the marks placed on livestock. The ring wasn't just jewelry. It was a property marker that could be used in court to prove ownership during disputes. Imagine having to present your wedding ring as evidence that you belong to your husband. The Romans actually required wives to wear their rings at all times in public, and removing it without permission was considered a form of theft, stealing yourself from your husband's property. But here's where Roman ring tradition gets absolutely wild. They believed that iron rings could absorb the strength and courage of fallen enemies. Roman soldiers would collect wedding rings from the battlefield, melt them down, and forge new rings for their own marriages. The idea was that each ring contained the accumulated power of everyone who had worn it before. Marcus Aurelius himself wrote in his personal letters about the iron ring tradition. Archaeological evidence from his private villa shows that his wedding ring contained metal from over 40 different sources. Rings taken from Germanic tribal leaders, Celtic warriors, and even Persian nobles. The Romans called this practice strength accumulation, and they believed it made their marriages as unbreakable as their military formations. General Scipio Africanus, the hero who defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC, started what became one of Rome's most brutal wedding traditions. After his victory over Carthage, he ordered his soldiers to collect every wedding ring from the fallen Carthaginian warriors. These rings were then presented to Roman couples as wedding gifts, with the belief that wearing jewelry from defeated enemies would ensure Roman supremacy in marriage, just as it had ensured victory in battle. But the truly shocking part of Roman ring tradition was their practice of ring dueling. This wasn't just ceremonial combat. This was actual, sometimes deadly, fighting to determine who had the right to marry a particular woman. Pliny the Elder documented over 60 cases of ring duels in his Natural History, describing them as contests of iron where only the survivor claims the bride. When multiple suitors wanted to marry the same woman, they would commission identical iron rings and meet at dawn in specially designated areas outside Roman cities. The men would fight with traditional weapons until one was defeated, not necessarily killed, but decisively beaten. The winner's ring would then be blessed by priests and presented to the bride, while the loser's ring was melted down and the metal donated to the Temple of Mars. One particularly famous ring duel took place in 89 AD between two Roman senators vying for the hand of Claudia Quinta, daughter of a wealthy patrician family. The duel lasted 4 hours and ended only when one contestant, Marcus Flavius, literally beat his opponent unconscious with a mace. Claudia Quinta had no say in the matter whatsoever. Roman law required her to marry whoever won the ring duel, regardless of her personal preferences. The psychological impact of wearing victory rings was so significant that Roman women developed what historians now call ring anxiety. Letters preserved from Pompeii described wives who were afraid to remove their rings, even for bathing, fearing that they might absorb weakness from the air and transfer it to their husbands. Some women hired servants whose only job was to polish and maintain their wedding rings, ensuring that the enemy's strength contained within the iron remained potent. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Roman ring tradition was their treatment of rings from failed marriages. When a Roman couple divorced, which was surprisingly common in ancient Rome, the woman's ring was publicly broken in the forum as a symbol of the marriage's failure. But here's the twisted part. The broken ring pieces were then sold to gladiator trainers who would force their fighters to wear the fragments as badges of shame. The Romans believed that wearing pieces of failed marriage rings would make gladiators fight more desperately, knowing that they carried the bad luck of broken vows into the arena. Gladiator remains found in Pompeii show clear evidence of wearing multiple ring fragments, some bearing inscriptions like Amor Mortis, love of death, etched into the iron by their previous owners. Emperor Caligula took Roman ring obsession to its logical extreme when he declared that all wedding rings in the empire had to be approved by imperial authorities before they could be worn. His agents would inspect rings for subversive symbols or metal that might have come from enemy territories. Rings that failed inspection were confiscated, and their owners faced exile or worse. The inspection process was thorough and terrifying. Imperial ring inspectors, called annularii, had the authority to break into homes and examine wedding jewelry. They looked for signs of foreign craftsmanship, non-Roman religious symbols, or metal that didn't meet imperial purity standards. Couples found wearing unapproved rings face immediate arrest, and their rings were publicly destroyed as examples to others. Here's something that will blow your mind. The Romans developed the world's first ring registry. Every legal marriage required the couple to register their rings with local authorities, complete with detailed descriptions of the metal composition, weight, and any inscriptions. These records were maintained in duplicate. One copy stayed in the local archives, while another was sent to Rome itself. The registry wasn't just it was a tool of imperial control. By tracking every wedding ring in the empire, Roman authorities could identify potential rebels, monitor the movement of precious metals, and even predict which regions might be planning uprisings based on changes in local ring-making patterns. But the most ingenious and sinister aspect of Roman ring policy was their use of wedding jewelry as military intelligence. Roman spies operating in foreign territories would study local ring designs to gather information about enemy tribes, their metalworking capabilities, their religious beliefs, and their military alliances. A ring's design could reveal everything from a tribe's access to trade routes to their relationships with neighboring peoples. Augustus Caesar's closest advisor established what was essentially the world's first intelligence network based entirely on wedding ring analysis. His agents would infiltrate foreign courts, Study the jewelry worn by nobles and their wives, and report back to Rome with detailed assessment of each nation's wealth, military capabilities, and political stability. The psychological warfare aspect was equally sophisticated. Romans would deliberately gift elaborate, beautiful wedding rings to the leaders of tribes they planned to conquer. These rings appear to be generous diplomatic gifts, but they actually served as markers when Roman armies later attacked. Soldiers had orders to specifically target anyone wearing Roman-gifted rings, eliminating potential leaders and demoralizing enemy forces. One documented case from the conquest of Britain shows how effective this strategy could be. Julius Caesar's forces had gifted ornate gold rings to several Celtic chieftains during peace negotiations. When the Romans later invaded, they used these rings to identify and systematically eliminate Celtic leadership, turning what should have been symbols of friendship into death sentences. The Romans were so successful at weaponizing wedding rings that other civilizations began developing countermeasures. Germanic tribes started creating false rings, decoy wedding jewelry designed to confuse Roman intelligence networks. Celtic Druids developed rituals to cleanse rings of Roman influence, while Persian nobles began wearing multiple rings to make it impossible for Romans to determine which ones were actually significant. As the Roman Empire grew more powerful, ring traditions became increasingly elaborate and brutal. But even the Romans, with all their military might and imperial ambition, couldn't have imagined what was coming next. Because as we move into the medieval period, wedding rings were about to become something even more terrifying than symbols of conquest. They were about to become instruments of torture, tools of justice, and weapons in a war between the forces of light and darkness that would make Roman ring duels look like children's games. Medieval judgment rings and the Black Death. The year is 1348, and the Black Death is sweeping across Europe like a merciless tide. But in the shadowy corridors of medieval castles, something even more sinister is happening. Wedding rings are being transformed into instruments of torture, judgment, and execution that would make the Spanish Inquisition take notes. Welcome to the Dark Ages. Do Us Part wasn't just a promise. It was often a literal countdown. Let me transport you to the fog-shrouded moors of medieval England, where Lady Margaret of Wessex is about to discover that her beautiful new wedding ring contains a secret that could end her life in the most excruciating way imaginable. During the medieval period, wedding rings weren't just symbols of love. They became weapons in a war between church and state, tools of religious persecution, and literally deadly tests of marital fidelity. The practice started innocently enough with something called feed rings, from the Latin fides meaning faith. These rings featured two hands clasping together, symbolizing the unity of marriage. Beautiful in concept, terrifying in execution, medieval craftsmen began designing these rings with a deadly twist. They were constructed so that if either hand the clasp design was tampered with, the ring would lock permanently onto the wearer's finger, cutting off circulation and eventually causing gangrene. Brother Thomas of Aquinas, a Dominican monk who kept detailed records of medieval court proceedings, documented over 300 cases between 1250 and 1400, where feed rings were used as instruments of medieval justice. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate torture, devices disguised as wedding jewelry. Unfaithful spouses, particularly women accused of adultery, would be forced to wear specially modified feed rings that would slowly tighten over the course of days or weeks. The most chilling case in Thomas's records involves a noble woman named Isabella de Clare, who was accused of having an affair with a traveling minstrel in 1387. Rather than face a traditional trial, she was given a choice between immediate execution or wearing a judgment ring that would prove her innocence or guilt through divine intervention. The ring was designed to gradually constrict if the wearer was guilty of the accused sin. Isabella chose the ring, confident in her innocence. For 3 days, the ring remained comfortable, and it seemed like divine justice would vindicate her. But on the 4th day, witnesses reported that the ring began to tighten. By the 7th day, Isabella's finger had turned black, and by the 10th day, she was begging for amputation. She died on the 14th day, still wearing the ring that had slowly crushed her finger bone. The truly horrifying part? The church declared this divine proof of her guilt, and her supposed lover was burned at the stake based solely on the ring's judgment. Modern analysis suggests these rings were designed with materials that would expand when exposed to the natural oils and sweat produced by stress and fear. The more terrified the accused became, the tighter the ring would get. But Isabella's case was just the beginning. The medieval church developed an entire theology around what they called annulus judicae. Pope Innocent IV actually issued a papal bull in 1252 endorsing the use of these rings as a form of trial by ordeal, claiming they allowed God to directly intervene in human justice. The rings came in different varieties for different crimes. Adultery rings tightened slowly over 2 weeks. Heresy rings contained hidden needles that would gradually extend into the flesh if the wearer was deemed guilty. Theft rings were designed to heat up when exposed to sunlight, literally branding the accused, as their guilt was revealed by God's light. Here's where it gets even more twisted. Medieval nobles began commissioning preemptive judgment rings for their wives before marriage. These rings appeared normal, but contained mechanisms that would activate if the woman was ever accused of infidelity. Medieval men were giving their brides torture devices disguised as symbols of love just in case they needed to punish them later. The monastery of St. Denis in France kept meticulous records of ring-based executions, and their archives reveal the shocking extent of this practice. Between 1300 and 1450, over 2,000 people died from judgment rings in France alone. The monks recorded not just the deaths, but detailed descriptions of how long each person survived, what they confessed during their ordeal, and whether the church deemed the ring's judgment to be accurate. One particularly disturbing entry from 1423 describes a mass trial where 12 women accused of witchcraft were all given judgment rings simultaneously. The monastery's records note that 9 of the women died. Modern historians believe this was actually a coordinated murder disguised as divine justice, possibly motivated by a land grab since all the accused women owned valuable property. But the medieval period's most infamous ring-related atrocity was the Ring of Ravenna massacre in 1398. A traveling merchant had been selling what he claimed were blessed wedding rings that would protect marriages from evil influences. When church authorities investigated, they discovered the rings contained a slow-acting poison that would kill the wearer over the course of several months. The merchant, Giovanni de Mercato, had been systematically poisoning newlyweds across northern Italy for over 3 years. His motivation wasn't religious or political. It was purely financial. He would sell the poison rings to couples, then return after their deaths to comfort the grieving families and offer to buy the deceased property at discounted prices. When Giovanni was finally caught, church authorities estimated he had murdered over 400 people with his poison rings. His execution was particularly brutal, even by medieval standards. He was forced to wear 12 of his own poison rings while being slowly burned at the stake. The process took over 6 hours, and witnesses reported that Giovanni was still conscious and screaming when the poison finally killed him, moments before the flames would have. The Giovanni case led to the establishment of the first ring inspectors, church officials whose job was to examine wedding jewelry for signs of tampering or poison. These inspectors developed an elaborate testing process involving blessed water, sacred oils, and even live animals that would be exposed to the rings to check for toxicity. Here's something that might make you look at your own wedding ring differently. Medieval ring inspectors discovered that many legitimate wedding rings were accidentally poisonous. The metals and dyes used in medieval jewelry often contained lead, mercury, and other toxic substances that could slowly poison the wearer over years of constant contact. The church began requiring all wedding rings to be blessed with special oils designed to neutralize these accidental poisons. But perhaps the most psychologically terrifying aspect of medieval ring tradition was the practice of spousal rings. When one spouse died, church law required the surviving partner to wear both wedding rings until they remarried or died themselves. This sounds touching until you realize that many of these deceased spouses' rings were believed to be cursed, haunted, or possessed by the dead partner's spirit. The church records from Canterbury Cathedral describe dozens of cases where widows reported that their deceased husband's ring would move on their finger, grow hot or cold without warning, or cause vivid nightmares about their dead spouse. Rather than removing these disturbing rings, church doctrine required widows to endure these supernatural torments as penance for outliving their husbands. One widow, Eleanor of Gloucester, reported in 1445 that her dead husband's ring had begun speaking to her in his voice, giving her instructions about how to manage their estate, and even commenting on her daily activities. The church initially dismissed these reports as grief-induced hallucinations. But when Eleanor accurately predicted 3 major political events based on information she claimed came from a ring, church authorities began investigating. Their conclusion was that Eleanor's husband's soul was trapped in a ring, unable to move on to the afterlife because of unfinished business on earth. Rather than help Eleanor remove the ring, the church designated her as an official spiritual medium and required her to wear the ring while providing counsel to other church members. Eleanor spent the last 15 years of her life essentially enslaved to her dead husband's ring, Force act as a supernatural consultant for the local diocese. The medieval period's ring traditions were so brutal and bizarre that they make Roman conquest rings look positively civilized. But even these dark ages couldn't prepare Europe for what was coming next, because as we transition into the Renaissance, a new type of wedding ring was about to emerge. One so ingeniously designed that it could expose secrets, solve crimes, and reveal hidden truths in ways that would make modern detective technology seem primitive by comparison.